Normandy, July 1944. A Sherman sits motionless behind a hedgerow. Engine off, hatches sealed, 30 meters ahead. A gap in the bocage. Beyond it, open ground. The crew has been waiting for 11 minutes. The gunner's hand rests on the traverse. The loader holds a shell against his chest. Then the sound comes. Tracks grinding against earth. A Panther. The Panther's turret appears through the gap. One shot. One hit. The German tank shudders and stops. Smoke pours from the engine deck. The crew inside never saw their killer. This Sherman carried something different. A 17-pounder gun, British engineering, Canadian crew, and a muzzle velocity that could crack a Panther's armour at 500 metres. Across Normandy that summer, German tankers would learn a painful lesson. The Canadians had rewritten the rules. This is the story of how they did it. When Canadian armoured units landed in Normandy, they inherited a crisis. The M4 Sherman was the backbone of Allied tank forces, reliable, easy to maintain, produced in vast numbers. But it was designed for infantry support and exploitation, not tank versus tank combat. Its 75mm gun lacked the velocity to defeat German heavy armour frontally. Its own armour, approximately 50mm on the hull front, could be penetrated by a Panther at over a kilometre. Against a Tiger's 88mm gun, the disparity was even greater. German tankers understood this imbalance. They positioned their Panthers and Tigers at the ends of narrow lanes, frontal armour facing the only approach. Allied tanks had to close the distance to have any chance of a kill shot. Most didn't make it. Canadian crews learned this reality within days of D-Day. On June 7th, near Orthy, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders encountered the 12th SS Panzer Division. The engagement was brief and catastrophic. German Panthers moved through gaps in Canadian positions, destroying Shermans with methodical precision. Over 100 Canadians were captured. Historical records indicate that a number of these prisoners were subsequently executed. Incidents later investigated as war crimes. The message was brutal and clear. Normandy's bocage made every engagement more dangerous. These were not open fields. The hedgerows dated back centuries, dense walls of earth, roots and vegetation standing 2 meters high. Between them lay sunken lanes, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Tanks could not push through. They could not flank. Every intersection was a potential kill zone. German forces had fortified this ground for months. They knew every firing lane, every ambush point. For Canadian armoured commanders, the bocage posed a question with no easy answer. How do you fight an enemy with superior tanks, in terrain that negates your numbers, with crews dying faster than replacements arrive? The answer would not come from Allied headquarters. It would come from the Canadians themselves. The first part of the solution had crossed the Channel with them. The Sherman Firefly was a British modification. A standard Sherman hull fitted with the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This was the same weapon used in British towed anti-tank batteries. It had proven capable of defeating Tigers in North Africa and Italy. Mounting it inside a Sherman turret was not elegant. The gun was longer, heavier and harder to load. The turret interior became cramped. Ammunition stowage was reduced. Recoil was punishing, but the Firefly could kill. At 500 meters, its armor-piercing round could penetrate approximately 130 to 140 millimeters of steel. At combat ranges in the bocage, often under 300 meters, it could defeat any German tank from any angle. Canadian armoured regiments received Fireflies at a ratio of approximately 1 per troop of 4 or 5 tanks. That single vehicle became the troop's only realistic counter to German heavy armour. German tankers recognized the threat quickly. Orders circulated through Panzer units. Identify and destroy the long-barreled Shermans first. The Firefly's distinctive silhouette made it a priority target. Canadian crews responded with field expedients. They painted the rear half of the barrel with countershading to break up its silhouette. Some applied netting. Others positioned Fireflies at the rear of formations, shielded by standard Shermans until the moment of engagement. The goal was simple: survive long enough to take the shot. But camouflage alone would not solve the problem. The Canadians needed tactics that allowed them to fight on their own terms. That challenge fell to their commanders. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds commanded 2nd Canadian Corps. At 40 years old, he was among the youngest corps commanders in any Allied army. He had led Canadian forces in Sicily and Italy. He understood armoured warfare, and he refused to accept attrition as strategy. Simonds studied the tactical problem with analytical precision. Daylight attacks against prepared positions meant predictable losses. German defenders knew the ground. They had pre-registered artillery. Their tanks sat in hull-down positions with overlapping fields of fire. The solution, Simonds concluded, was to attack when the enemy couldn't see, at night. This was not a conventional proposal. Armoured formations depended on visibility. Coordination in darkness was considered nearly impossible. Tanks could collide, lose direction, or fire on friendly units. Simonds didn't dismiss these concerns. He engineered solutions. He ordered searchlights positioned miles behind the front, their beams aimed at low clouds. The reflected glow would create artificial moonlight, enough illumination to navigate without revealing positions. He directed Bofors anti-aircraft guns to fire tracer rounds on fixed lines, marking the axis of advance. He distributed compasses mounted on tank hulls and assigned radio beacons to guide columns. That moving infantry remained the deadliest problem of all. Moving infantry across open ground under fire meant unacceptable casualties. Machine guns and mortars could shred formations before they reached German lines. Simonds' answer was to put the infantry inside armour. He ordered the conversion of M7 Priest self-propelled guns and Ram tanks, vehicles no longer needed for their original roles. Engineers stripped the turrets, reinforced the hulls, and created troop compartments. The result was the Kangaroo, an armoured personnel carrier improvised in the field. Each Kangaroo could carry a full infantry section directly into battle. Soldiers dismounted meters from enemy positions instead of crossing hundreds of meters under fire. No other Allied force had operationalized this concept at corps scale. The Canadians built it from necessity. By early August, the pieces were in place. The Fireflies were concealed among standard Shermans. The infantry had armoured transport. The night attack was planned. The real test would come within days. Canadian units in Normandy learned to fight as integrated teams. Tanks did not advance alone. Infantry cleared hedgerows to prevent ambushes. Engineers blew gaps in embankments for armour to pass. Artillery suppressed known German gun positions before armoured columns moved. This coordination was not instinctive. It was learned through repeated costly engagements, after Orthy, after Verrières Ridge. After each difficult action, Canadian officers adjusted their methods. By late July, tank troops operated with a discipline their enemies had not anticipated. Fireflies waited in concealment while standard Shermans advanced. Infantry riding Kangaroos dismounted into cover at precisely timed intervals. Artillery barrages walked ahead of columns with increasing accuracy. The crews themselves changed. Replacements arrived with minimal training, sometimes just weeks of instruction before being assigned to a fighting unit. They learned under fire, absorbing lessons from veterans who had survived June and July. Those who adapted quickly lived. Many did not. Fatigue became constant. Tank crews operated on little sleep, rotating through maintenance, guard duty, and combat. The mental strain of waiting in ambush, knowing a penetrating hit meant fire, wore on even experienced men. But by August, the Canadians had built something the Germans did not expect. German reports from July and August 1944 recorded growing concern about Canadian armoured operations. Officers noted that Canadian armour was engaging from unexpected positions. Shermans that should have been outmatched were destroying Panthers at range. The long-barreled tanks appeared suddenly and withdrew before effective response. For crews of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the change was disorienting. They had entered Normandy confident in their superiority. Their Panthers were among the finest medium tanks in the world. Their training was rigorous. Their early engagements against Canadian units seemed to confirm their expectations. Now their tanks were burning in the hedgerows. Confidence is fragile in combat. Once broken, it spreads through units. By early August, German armoured commanders in Normandy faced a troubling reality. They were no longer fighting the enemy they expected. and a far greater blow was about to fall. August 7th, 1944. 2300 hours. South of Caen, over 1,000 Canadian and British armoured vehicles began to move. There was no preliminary bombardment to warn of the attack. No massed infantry assault to signal intentions. Just columns of tanks grinding forward in the darkness. The artificial moonlight worked. Searchlights bounced diffused glow off low clouds, illuminating the ground just enough to navigate. Tracer fire from Bofors guns marked the line of advance. Kangaroos carrying infantry rolled behind the lead tanks. Inside, soldiers gripped their weapons and waited. German sentries heard the engines. They couldn't see the targets. By midnight, the first line of German positions had been overrun. The 89th Infantry Division, holding the forward zone, reported confusion and fragmented communications. Units were isolated. Strongpoints fell before reinforcements could respond. By dawn on August 8th, Canadian forces had advanced approximately 4 miles into German-held territory. The breach was real. Wehrmacht commanders reacted with urgency. Panther and Tiger units from the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division moved toward the breakthrough. Their mission was to close the gap before Canadian forces could exploit it. They expected to find disorganized columns, vulnerable targets. Instead, they found Canadian tank troops positioned along tree lines and ridges. As German armour advanced in the morning light, 17-pounder gunners tracked them through their sights. Near Santo, Shermans of the British Columbia Regiment engaged Panthers at ranges under 400 metres. The 1st Hussars reported multiple kills in engagements that lasted minutes. The counterattack stalled. Among the Panzer commanders moving to stop the Canadian advance was SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann. Wittmann was among the most recognised tank commanders in Germany. Official records credited him with destroying a substantial number of Allied tanks and anti-tank guns across the eastern and western fronts, though exact figures remain subject to historical debate. His Tiger had become a symbol of German armoured capability. On August 8, 1944, Wittmann led a column of Tigers toward the Canadian breakthrough near Gomenil. He never arrived. In the fields near Saint-Agnan-de-Craменil, Wittmann's Tiger was struck and destroyed. Wittmann and his crew were killed. Attribution remains debated. Evidence points to Fireflies operating in the area, likely from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers or A Squadron of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Other possibilities, including air attack, have been proposed. What mattered that August morning was simpler. One of Germany's most celebrated tank commanders had been stopped by the forces he had been sent to destroy. The pocket was beginning to close. Operation Totalize cracked the German line. Operation Tractable, launched August 14th, would seal the trap. Canadian and Polish forces drove south toward Falaise. American units swung north from the opposite direction. The objective was encirclement, trapping the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army before they could escape. German commanders ordered retreat. The orders came too late. Roads clogged with vehicles, horse-drawn transport and retreating infantry. Allied aircraft turned those roads into targets. Canadian armour pressed through villages reduced to rubble. The fighting was constant. Crews who had survived June and July now operated on reserves of endurance they didn't know they had. On August 19th, the 1st Polish Armoured Division seized Hill 262, a critical height overlooking the last German escape corridor. They held it against repeated counterattacks, suffering significant casualties. On August 21st, 1944, the Falaise Pocket was effectively sealed. Inside lay the remnants of 2 German armies. When Allied forces entered the pocket, they found a landscape of devastation. Burned vehicles stretched across the countryside. Overturned artillery blocked roads. Dead horses, the German army still relied heavily on horse transport, lay among the wreckage in large numbers. Casualty estimates vary by source. Records suggest that between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers may have been killed inside the pocket, with another 40 to 50,000 captured. Those who escaped generally did so without equipment. Tanks abandoned, artillery destroyed, vehicles burned. The 12th SS Panzer Division was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Its tank numbers, which had exceeded 150 vehicles on D-Day, reportedly fell to fewer than a dozen operational. Experienced crews who had survived years of combat were dead or captured. The vehicles they had crewed were wreckage. General Dwight Eisenhower toured the pocket afterward. In his memoirs, he described scenes of such destruction that only Dante could have rendered them adequately. The German army in the West would not recover from what happened in those fields. Victory carried its own weight. Canadian forces suffered approximately 18,000 casualties throughout the Normandy campaign. Killed, wounded, and missing. Armoured regiments absorbed a significant portion of those losses. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers, the Fort Garry Horse, the 1st Hussars, the British Columbia Regiment. Each recorded casualties that marked their regimental histories. Tank crews faced particular dangers. A penetrating hit usually meant fire. In a Sherman, fire meant seconds to escape, or none at all. Survivors often carried burns for the rest of their lives. Others carried memories that would not fade. The men who made it through August were not the same men who had landed in June. They had learned things about themselves and about war that could not be unlearned. The innovations developed in Normandy spread across Allied armies. The kangaroo concept became doctrine. Armoured personnel carriers, improvised from necessity in the summer of 1944, evolved into standard equipment for mechanized infantry in subsequent decades. Simon's night attack methods influenced future operations. The principle of attacking when the enemy could not effectively respond became foundational to armoured planning. The integration of specialist vehicles into tank formations established a model that persisted long after the war ended. American and British planners studied Canadian after-action reports. The lessons of Normandy shaped armoured doctrine for years afterward. For the men who fought, legacy was quieter. They returned to Canada, to farms and factories and families who had waited years for news. Many never spoke in detail of what they witnessed. The medals went into drawers. The difficult memories remained private. The Germans entered Normandy with superior tanks. On paper, the balance favoured the defenders. But war is not fought on paper. The Canadians who crewed those Shermans understood something that could not be manufactured. Adaptation matters more than specification. Discipline matters more than design. They camouflaged their most dangerous weapons. They attacked when the enemy expected safety. They built what they needed from what they had. The cost was measured in lives. Young men from Saskatchewan and Ontario and Nova Scotia who never returned home. Officers who led from the front because they would not order men where they would not go themselves. Their tanks are gone now, preserved in museums or long since scrapped. But what those men demonstrated endures. That determination combined with ingenuity can overcome material disadvantage. That ordinary men, facing difficult odds, can still find a way forward. Normandy was not won by Shermans. It was won by the Canadians who refused to let their Shermans fail. If this story of Canadian tank crews adapting Shermans in the hedgerows of Normandy stayed with you, please consider liking this video. It helps Canadian Legacy continue sharing thoughtful, well-researched stories from the Second World War. Subscribe if you value calm, fact-driven history that focuses on the people behind the machines. And if your family has a Normandy connection, a name, a photograph, or a memory, feel free to share it in the comments. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.